Thank you very much. I'm deeply honored. It was a surprise that I was invited here for this lecture, and I'm deeply honored to be delivering the Dr. Ryan address. We have some points of commonality. First, I read Dr. Ryan's books in French when I was a teenager a long time ago in Paris, and was inspired by his pioneering work in parapsychology. The only point in common is that we both have problems with our hair, as you can see on this picture. The title tonight is The Software of Consciousness, and most of my early career in science has been with software development. And as Ed mentioned, I've had the opportunity to work closely with people interested in consciousness research. And you'll see why I felt that there was a correlation between the two that I've summarized as intriguing lessons and lingering puzzles. Of course, the lessons are interesting, but the puzzles are even more interesting on the far side of Stargate. As you all know, Stargate was the name of an extraordinary project that lasted many years, both at SRI and at ACIC, and went through a number of different names, including Real Flame and other names. The subject brings up two kinds of things. First, things that were not known before, even though there have been a number of publications, including recent ones, the books by Russell Targ, and the books by Ed May, and the books by Dean about that project. But it's now almost 50 years since the inception of Stargate at SRI, and there are a number of things that, as you will see, have not been quite known before. So it's always fun to look back and, now it can be told a kind of revelation because it brings up some points that may be important for the future. We know everything that happened in the past officially, and all the things that are on record, but there are a number of things that are not on record and may contain some instances of new ideas. And that's what I'd like to talk about. Part of that has to do with new opportunities for research tools. And I'd like to propose to you that computers, especially computer networks today, have changed a lot, obviously in the last 50 years, but they've changed a lot in the last 5 years. And now they present an opportunity as tools for research in the psychical domain. So that's some of the things I want to touch on. That technology today has evolved to the point of providing stimulating, controversial, and inexpensive tools to advance research we all want to do. I'll follow coming from a software tradition, I like to follow the framework that IBM instituted. You give your conclusions at the beginning. So if some of you have to leave, you can go ahead early. Then you explain how you came to those conclusions, and then you summarize the conclusions at the end. That's a typical marketing pitch of IBM salespeople, and it works every time. So the first conclusion is that the new digital media, such as social networks, what we call now social networks, that have been known before under other names, exhibit spontaneous psychic phenomena. And programmers and hackers have known that for a long time. Of course, they are not especially motivated to go do psychic research. But the kind of thing that I'm talking about is you wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and you think, I found the solution to this particular problem, and I'm going to get up, go to the terminal and put the solution in the system. And then you find that 5 minutes later, one of your colleagues or somebody in India is asking the question, where you've just presented the answer. And that happens so frequently that hackers and programmers just don't really pay much attention to it. But it's as if these networks, because they annihilate the sense of time and space, have made psychic functioning more spontaneous. Of course, this is not being studied seriously, but it's something that we could use as a tool. The second conclusion is that this is a really economical opportunity to do direct experiments, some of which have started to be done within this community. But I'd like to give you some examples of how we started studying this a long time ago in connection with the Stargate project of Russell and Hal Puthoff at SRI. The point is that you can control external conditions, which has been one of the major problems. When the skeptics look at what you do, they say, yeah, well, it's very interesting. It would be really interesting if you could control it. But how do we know that these people are not in collusion or that there wasn't some external factor that made it likely that they would meet at that particular time and do this? So here on a computer network, if you're careful, you can control many of those conditions. The third one is that there are many things in physics now, you know, entanglement and quantum physics and so on, that suggest phenomena that could be useful in trying to explain or better understand the psychical domain. And the temptation is for psychic research to follow physics and sort of to go begging at the physics institution saying, give us new tools to understand entanglement because maybe that's how minds communicate and so on. And I think that's a trap. I think it's useful, of course, to learn to be current with the new physics, but I don't think that's the way this discipline should move. I think psychical research should lead and not follow physics. And thank you. So I'll try to develop these three arguments in the rest of the presentation. So let's look towards the future. One way to do that is to look at coffee grains in the cup. But we now have better technology. And when you look at this, at the future, it's useful to start with looking at what the experts have been saying. Freeman Dyson, who is an authority, as you know, in physics and an authority for federal research, has said ESP is real, as the anecdotal evidence suggests, but it cannot be tested with the clumsy tools of science. And when he wrote that, he was probably right. I mean, who am I to question Freeman Dyson? But what was true then may not be true today because technology is moving very, very, very fast. And it's opening up new domains. Contrast that with Charlie Tart saying last month, we already know some basic forms of psi can happen. We should be working on finding out how to help them happen more reliably and strongly, which is exactly my point, which would then lead us fruitfully to study the mechanisms by which they happen. So it's not enough to say, yeah, it happens, it's true, but let's dig deeper and let's find the mechanisms, all of which has great applications, not only for science, but for ideas about what spirituality may be. So those are two points that inspire us to think about how to do the research. Stargate and the challenge of remote viewing goes back to 1971. I think that's probably a year before Russ and Hal joined SRI. But at the time I was working, I was already at SRI, in one of the other divisions, as I'll mention later. And one of the vice presidents at SRI, named Roy Amara, was a futures researcher and had said something that is really very profound. If you want to imagine the world 10 years from now, you should look 50 years in the past. In other words, you should look 5x in the past if you want to start thinking about 10 years in the future. 50 years ago, we were on the moon. Remember that? Okay, I mean, not all of you remember that. But I remember that. I remember the first landing on the moon. And, we are going to go back to the moon with new devices, with new science, with new knowledge. But it's good to look at what was done 50 years ago and learn the lessons from Apollo, are inspiring the kind of spacecraft we're building now. So I'm going to argue that it's the same in your area. It's the same in psychical research. So 50 years ago, there was a little group in Porto La Valley of people who liked to talk about psychic things. And it was a group of amateurs, but amateurs from companies, from Stanford University, from Intel, from Hewlett-Packard. So these were people from the high-tech community who were interested in psychical things, and they would get together. And Hal and Russ, I'm sure Russ remembers those days, were members of that, and you could discuss experiments. You could bring in people from Europe who had done experiments in Europe and so on, and discuss what was going on. And it was a wonderful setting. And then Russ and Hal went to SRI and tried to convince SRI to let them build a formal program in psychic research at SRI, which was really the first time that physicists were going to do psychic research, which traditionally had been done by people from other disciplines, either medical specialists or psychologists. So it was a new dimension, a new way of coming into this research, which made it extraordinarily interesting, and extraordinarily interesting in Silicon Valley, of course. And Ingo Swann, who was one of the best-known psychical subjects on the East Coast, was available to come as a consultant. I remember that, and I wish, this is not in any of the books, but the place where we met was a house that had been built by a professor of architecture at Stanford. And he had built his house in the San Andreas Fault. Now, so the San Andreas Fault is about half a mile wide. It's essentially gravel, and it's been moving for the last hundreds of millions of years. And that's usually when you do real estate in California, you don't want to be anywhere close to the the world's major earthquake fault. He thought the problem is the consistency of the house. It's not the ground. I mean, the ground moves anyway. So he built his house as a big A-frame, which was extraordinarily strong and flexible. And he built it on railroad steel that he sank into the gravel. And it was an absolutely wonderful house because you had this feeling that the earth can move at any time. There was a little stream that was flowing under the house. I'm sure the house is still there. I mean, no earthquake is going to destroy that house. It may move it a little bit towards Alaska and Japan, but so in 200 million years, your house will be somewhere else, but I'm sure it will still be there. And it was a wonderful experience to sit there with people discussing this kind of subject, especially since there was no money in those days. There was no funding. The government was not interested, so we could talk about anything we wanted. And at that point, there were, and this is missing again from the books, there were two extraordinary programs that were starting at SRI. One of them was called the Arpanet. ARPA is the Advanced Research Project Agency of the Pentagon, Their first big project was the first rocket that orbited a satellite, an American satellite, after many failures. The second project was the first computer network in the world. And SRI had machine number 2 on the Arpanet. I don't need to tell you how many dozens of millions of computers are on the web today. SRI had machine number 2. And it was a prototype for the internet, which started in 1980, and then from the web. And today, when you ask people, do you use the internet? They say, oh, yes. They are not using the internet. You're using the web, which is a thin layer of human interfaces and graphic interfaces that have been designed on top of the internet. The internet is still there. And the protocols are the protocols of the Arpanet that were invented around 1970, 1971, 72. And SRI had a major role in helping to build to build that structure. The structure was built by about 200 people, so nobody has a credit of being, the father of the internet. There were 200 mothers and fathers. But I do remember those days, and I was at SRI before Russell and Hal Puthoff. And then Stargate started initially as a small project, funded with some money from NASA. That was brought by Ed Mitchell, was one of the founders of this institute, and was deeply interested, as you all know, deeply interested in psychical functioning. And the project went through a number of names like Scanate and Grill Flame and so on. At the time when I became involved, it was called Grill Flame. So I was on another floor working with a man named Doug Engelbart and Jake Feinler. Among other things, we built the first network information center for the internet, for the Arpanet, which became the internet. And the first public demonstration of the network was in 1972 in Washington. So again, the web has a long tradition and a long history that goes back to those days. And there were converging interests between what we were doing with the network, with the world's first computer network, and what Russell and Hal were doing with psychic research. The project that we had on the Arpanet was called the augmentation of human intellect. So, it wasn't shy. It wasn't, we were not hiding behind fancy words. The idea was, what's the point of building a computer network if you cannot augment human intellect? So it was a very ambitious software development project. And at the same time, there were people like Ingo Swann coming into the Stargate project, who were first interested in technology, because the project was going to be sponsored by the government. And the point of the project was going to be to look at the technology from other countries, starting with the Soviet Union. So this was serious in terms of technology, and Ingo wanted to learn as much as he could while at SRI from the technology that was being developed at SRI, because Ingo was a great artist, but he really didn't know much about technology. My own background, I was delighted when, so I had met Hal and Russell in that house on the fault, on the San Andreas fault. But so we renewed our acquaintance at SRI. And the fact that we were all at SRI, we could now, there was a sense of trust that was built. And I had been interested, I had not done psychical research, but I had followed the research done in France. I was very close to Rémy Chauvin in particular, and to Olivier Costa de Beauregard, who was a French relativist, who had been looking at all the questions about relativity and space and time and consciousness, and had written prominent articles about that. And it turned out that Ingo was extremely interested in UFOs because he had seen UFOs when he grew up in Colorado. And then little by little, we discovered that many of the gifted psychics who came through were screened at SRI for Stargate, had a lifelong interest in UFOs, either as a subject or because they had seen something or because they had been inspired by something or because they had somebody close to them in their family who had had an experience. So they wanted to discuss the research that I was doing on UFOs on my own. And that was, so I became sort of an unpaid consultant to the project. Unpaid because this was, I mean, the project became secret at that point. But there was another level of secret that, I mean, it was hard enough to be doing remote viewing at an institution like SRI, that if you added flying saucers to the mix, that really wouldn't work. So this was a secret they couldn't tell to their sponsor, which was, the CIA. So the CIA, under cover of various other institutions, because nobody knew really who really should be financing this. And around that time, I was working, programming the Arpanet and programming our Network Information Center for the Arpanet community, which by then was 50 computers around the country. And the head of their division, a man named Bart Cox, came into my office, closed the door, and said, "I'd like your advice on something, because you know Hal Puthoff and Targ, and they are writing proposals to fund psychical research here at SRI. We haven't done that before. It may be a great idea, but the board has, there are people on the board who are skeptics. The board of SRI is a very, very prestigious who is who in California in big business, including Bechtel, he said, let me draw you a picture. So he drew a scale on my whiteboard with a small square on one side where he wrote $1 million. Says the most we're going to get if we get sponsored, if we get psychical research sponsored, is maybe $1 million a year, which would be adequate, which would be good. And then on the other side, he put a huge square where he wrote $100 million. He said, $100 million is what research we do per year here in my division for Xerox, IBM, Hewlett-Packard, AT&T, and the big, the Fortune 100, which is what we do here. So should we jeopardize our reputation and potentially lose that $100 million a year of fundamental work for American industry by doing, funny things with psychic research? And he said, you've done your, fairly risky research, yourself, and you haven't jeopardized your career. And the proof is that you're here working for us. So we need to learn how to do that. We need to learn what you've done with UFOs, keeping your reputation intact, even though everybody knows you're working on UFOs. And we need to learn this, to do it with psychic research. This has not been published anywhere, by the way. I mean, this was... I'm not sure that people in the project even knew about that meeting. And I said, look, the reason I came to SRI, the reason 800 PhDs have come to SRI, is that we solve the problems that other people cannot solve. Okay? People like IBM and Xerox, the reason they bring their work here is that their labs have failed to find a solution. SRI had, Xerox couldn't make the Xerox machine work. It's SRI that found the flaws and fixed the technology for Xerox under contract with Xerox. It's SRI that did the methodology and the technology to eliminate electrostatic buildup on the wings of airliners, so that high-speed airliners would not be subject to electromagnetic problems and so on. So SRI does frontier research. And I said, we should be proud to have Russ and Hal, in this institution, because this is the next step. I mean, this is why people are motivated to come work here. And I said, furthermore, I hear that the research can be classified, but it shouldn't be completely classified because that's too important for, the rest of science should know about this if it works. The problem is that the skeptics will be all over the place, trying to kill the research the moment they hear about it. But the fact that it can be classified, you may have 2 or 3 years of quiet research where nobody will know what's really going on. And, a lot of the research in a place like SRI is not published. It's done for a client, it's done, and then the applications go into the mainstream. And same thing at RAND, same thing at Battelle's. I mean, there are, you can count that kind of institution on the fingers of one hand in the United States and 2 hands worldwide. That's what they do. And I said, you can protect their research, quietly for 2 or 3 years if it's classified, but the main findings that have to do with consciousness should be published. Be published in Nature, should be published in Science, should be published in the IEEE and so on. And he said, well, write me a memo about that I can take to the board. And I wrote a 2-page memo, essentially spelling that out, that the research should be a blend of openness, SRI should leave it open in terms of the fundamental findings, but then the technology development, which is what would be attacked. How you do it, what you try, what experiments fail, what experiments succeed, that could be done sort of under some, maybe not cover, but at least under some confidentiality, which would enable you to build something that could not be attacked easily by all the skeptical press. Ingo had concerns of his own. Ingo, when I say Silicon Valley is not Greenwich Village, what I mean is that Ingo lived in New York, had a wonderful brown house in Greenwich Village. All his friends were there. He was an artist. He thought Silicon Valley was culturally empty, void. Which is true. In 1971, there wasn't much in Silicon Valley that was very inspiring to an artist. And the sky is always blue. It's always 70 degrees outside. It's boring. He didn't have the stimulation that he grew up with on the East Coast. And this is serious. He was really, on the verge of resigning every 2 weeks. The other thing is that he was, where do you start a project like that? Well, you start with the Zener cards and the classic experiments. And he was intensely bored with that. He said, that's not what I do. So I said, what is it you do, Ingo? And we became friends. We used to have lunch together because he wanted to talk about UFOs again. So, and I wanted to talk about what he did. And he said, well, what I do is that I can move my consciousness anywhere in the universe, in space and time. And I said, that's not Zener cards, okay? And he said, furthermore, the project has to do with high technology. We're going to look at Soviet high technology that cannot be looked at in any other way except with remote viewing. So I need to learn as much as I can about high technology. So I told him, hey, do you know how computers get information? And he said, no, I have no idea. I mean, I've never worked with any computers. Again, 1971, people didn't have computers. There were no personal computers. No. Most computers would fill this room. And then there were smaller computers, like the ones running the Arpanet, but people didn't have them. So I said, well, to make it simple, there's 4 ways we can get the computer to get information. The simplest one is immediate addressing. You write an instruction that says pi equals 3.1400, and then the program works with that, with pi. So we all know what pi is once and for all. Most cases, it doesn't work that way. You have information which is in a memory cell, and you have to go get it. So it's called addressing. I know it's in cell, in this case, 567. I say, fetch whatever is in cell 567, and it's a number 23, and then the number 23 is a number I'm going to work with. Then it gets more complicated because you don't know the cell where it is. You have an equation that's going to compute the cell where it is. So this is called indirect addressing. Again, I'm simplifying the technology, but essentially that's the way computers still work today. I mean, that's the way they've worked since the Turing machine. And you say fetch the contents of the memory cell whose address is inside memory cell 567, which I just computed, which will be different in 5 minutes, and it gets me to another cell, and I find the answer 23. But the most interesting form is when you're looking at something which isn't in your memory. You have a computer with a 10 million word memory, and you have a database somewhere which is 100 billion words or 100 trillion words. And you have to, your instruction says fetch X, which is not in this computer. And then the only way to do that is statistically with a hatch code that is going to generate a formula to go retrieve things that are like what you're looking for and bring them back. When you use Google and you ask Google to look up something, you're going to get 500 answers or more. And then you can refine that search to what you want, and that's what will be in your computer. It will be brought into your computer. Today we call that the cloud. In those days it wasn't called the cloud, it was a set of disks somewhere, but it was the same principle. So Ingo thought about that because it was the best analogy I could give him to what he described that his brain was doing or his mind was doing when he was accessing a remote location with remote viewing. And that's where coordinate remote viewing came from. And this, again, not written in any books. Ingo wrote it in a report on Scanate in December 95, many years later. He said, I consulted a number of scientists outside of the SRI orbit, but not far away in Silicon Valley. No one could recommend anything. But Jacques Vallee recognized the problem as one of addresses. He said that you need an address that gets the perceptual channel to the right place, exactly as one needs a street address to find a house or an address menu code in a computer to find and call up the desired information. So this is why Scanate was built on longitude and latitude, which is what Ingo used as a convenient address. We could use anything else. And in fact, as the project evolved, they started using other kinds of addressing. But essentially, that was the origin of coordinate remote viewing. At the same time, social networking was born. It was born first on the Arpanet. Everybody thinks of Facebook. You know, Facebook is a social network. But the idea was, in fact, the initial software was built a long time ago. And when I left SRI, their project was still going on, of course. It went on for another 20 years. And I was recruited by the Institute for the Future that had contracts with and grants from the National Science Foundation and ARPA, which became DARPA, to build the first social network on the Arpanet. And we developed a program called Forum that enabled people from any location who had terminals to get on the network and share memory so that they could all talk to each other at the same time as you would with Twitter, or archive messages that would be seen to other people whenever they came into the system. So we had these two modes of working, and it was a 4-year project that I ran with this, the group that you see here. The second gentleman from the right is Olaf Helmer, who had invented the Delphi technique for forecasting that has been used in industry ever since. So my problem was that this was the first computer science project where you needed to know something about the user. You know, if you're programming something in mathematics, you don't care who uses it. You know, they use the equation, they get the answer, and that's the end of that. Here, people were going to talk to each other about a number of things, including crisis management, including long-term discussions about energy, about federal resources, about when are we going to run out of oil. I mean, the National Foundation was calling me every couple of days saying, we have an oil crisis, you know, how can you help link together the experts through the network so that we don't have to fly them to a central place, and we can eventually, the nation could save gasoline because we're all going to be talking through networks. And those ideas were already there in the 70s. Okay, that's where everything comes from. Again, the idea you have to look back 50 years if you want to look forward 10. My problem was, how do I calibrate the user? Because I don't know who they are. And I had a sociologist, a very gifted sociologist named Bob Johansen. Dr. Robert Johansen came from the sociology of religion, which happened to be extremely appropriate to what we were doing, because we were building a community of people who were going to be independent of space and time. And coming from religion, he understood that very well. So, you know, in engineering, once you've built a prototype that works, you're supposed to break it. You're not supposed to, you know, to start selling it to people, because it's going to break sooner or later. So you want to break it yourself to understand how it breaks, and then, you know, strengthen it and make it better. So I wanted to break Forum that we had developed. And I thought, to break it, I need to bring users to the cutting edge of their thinking. And I was talking to Ingo, and we thought, why not use psychics? Why not put people in an environment where they are going to do psychical experiments? Because at the same time, there were things that SRI wasn't doing, but they were interested in what computer networks were going to do. Again, these two projects were very much parallel. So we were a community of people who were talking to each other, really at the frontier, both of technology and consciousness research. So we thought, well, you know, we have Russell, we have Hal Puthoff, we have Ingo, we have their subjects, their psychics. Let's do an experiment, but let's not do it on the Arpanet, because the Arpanet is a federal facility. Let's do it on a commercial network. So we transferred the program to timeshare, to TimeNet. You know, computer networks already existed. They were there for business, and they were fairly primitive compared to the Arpanet, but they worked. So the only problem is that we had to pay for the machine time and the memory. So we found a sponsor. We found a sponsor who said, go do the experiment that NSF and ARPA and your sponsors would never let you get away with. And I said, psychic research. So, but Ingo said, let's not do Zener cards because it's so boring. And the traditional test in psychical research, if you had gifted subjects and you wanted to extinguish their ability to do something psychic, you should get them to do Zener card guessing, you know. And most of the tests that we're still using today are so boring. that people will run away from it or they will lose their ability. And that's what Ingo was saying. Ingo was saying the more complex, the better. Nature, complex technology, that's what we're going to be studying. And the Russians who are building nuclear submarines, Typhoon-class submarines in Semipalatinsk are not going to send us xenocards, okay? They are working on something complex. So the more complex, the better. So we built a computer conference in 1975. It ran for almost 2 months over TimeNet, which was a commercial computer network, which we were paying. There were 12 participants in California, New York. I told Ingo, you can stay in Greenwich Village. You don't have to come to California, which you hate because the sky is blue. You can stay in New York with your friends. We'll give you a terminal and we'll teach you how to use it. And at the time, part of the research I was doing, we had found that the geologists were very interested in Menlo Park is the headquarters of the Western State Geological Survey. And I had many friends there, and we had started to work with them to link together their branch in Alaska, which was very isolated, with the Western State branch in Menlo Park, with Washington, where the administration of the survey is located. So they were very interested in using the computer networking for that, and we had a series of computer conferences with them, which, by the way, we published eventually. So, and we had access to SRI, and we had private funding. So, but this, this was not a project in psychical research, and I don't want to push it too far in that direction. I'll tell you what we found, but keep in mind, this was a proof of concept for us in computer science. I wanted to know two things. First, can the network serve as a tool for accurate and unobtrusive recording of what people, what are the events that happen when people are together on the network at the same time. Remember, everybody could type at the same time here, and the central memory would be well behaved, which wasn't easy to do, and would distribute the messages at the time when they were typed, when they were finished. But there was a stamp, a time stamp in minutes and seconds about the time when the message was started. So we had complete control of all the interaction all around the network, which doesn't happen in psychical research usually. The second thing I wanted to do was find out, Charlie Tart had come up with the expression altered state of consciousness. We were creating an altered state. People felt suspended in sort of a consciousness state. Even people who were not involved in psychic research was spontaneously telling us about anecdotes like that, about synchronicities, about things of that type. So I wanted to document that, and I wanted to find out what kind of environment are we creating for our users. Terminals, I'm sure nobody in this room has seen this kind of thing. It's a TI 700. It's a wonderful machine. Texas Instruments made them. It was the first workable remote computer. It had the two little black things that you see in the back were called rabbit ears, because you would take the phone, you would call the computer would send you a dial tone, and then you would quickly push the phone into the two rubber cups that we call the rabbit ears. That's why I'm calling this slide of psychics and rabbit ears. And so we bought terminals and we sent them to everybody, and we trained them how to use it before the conference. In those days, it wasn't like getting on the web today. I mean, it took a little bit of, hand-holding and, signals to actually get on the network, and it didn't always work. But, it was still pretty good. And we designed a number of experiments around rocks. Now, I remembered Ingo telling me, we need something that is complex, that is natural, that has richness and, beingness, factual stuff. And since I was working with a survey, I went over, and I had a close friend who was a geologist from Alaska. And he took me back in the back rooms at the U.S. Geological Survey, which conveniently is the next building behind SRI. And geologists are funny. They have bookshelves like everybody else, but they don't have any books. The bookshelves are filled with rocks. And you ask them, why do you have all these rocks? And they say, oh, this particular rock, I found when I was canoeing down, a river in Alaska, and I saw the glint of sunshine on this rock, and I stopped my canoe, and I went to get it with my hammer, and this rock is unique because of this and that. So they give you this very poetic, rap about the rock. So I said, what we want are rocks that are unique around a number of dimensions. And I'll go a little bit faster because I want to get to the punchline here. And then we did experiments. We took the rocks, we put them in envelopes, and then we did a double-blind thing when we asked people from the staff of the Institute to come in and put them in a second, larger envelope that had no designation, so that nobody knew what was inside the inner envelope of any of those samples. There were 10 samples that I'm going to show you. And then we had 2 series of experiments because we wanted to see what happened when the rock was held by a geologist in his hand in Menlo Park, and then people from all over could come in through the network and describe the rock. But it was okay if they read the mind of the geologist, and the geologist knows what the rock is, or they could describe the rock directly. We didn't care. We just wanted to see how it would work. And then we also had a series of experiments with the rocks in the double-blind envelopes that nobody knew, even the geologists didn't know which rock was there for that particular day. And then people could come in anytime during the day using the network and describe what's in the envelope. All we told them was, it's on the table in an empty office at the Institute for the Future in Menlo Park. Go get it. It was always at the same spot. And we didn't know what it was until we opened up everything at the end. So the participants were, and when I look at this, we were very fortunate. We had a who is who in psychic research in the 70s. We had Ingo, Richard Bach, the author of Jonathan Livingston Seagull, who turned out to be an extraordinary remote viewer. Arthur Hastings, who many of you may remember, who worked in part here. As a facilitator, he was a psychologist from Stanford, but very involved in psychic research. He was at home with a terminal. Gerald Askevold was my counterpart at the survey, at the U.S. Geological Survey. Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ were part of it. Brendan O'Regan, who worked here for many years. Gertrude Schmeidler, Alan Vaughn, who was a psychic in San Francisco. These are, I think, all names that you have encountered either personally or in the literature. Jean Baudot, who was a friend of mine, psychical researcher at the University of Montreal. Thad Wilson, who was on my staff. Andy Hardy, who was on my staff. And Aaron Katz, who was our sponsor. The targets, I asked the geologist, select from your collections, which are already very selected rocks. These are special rocks that they keep. Find me 10 samples along the dimensions of beauty and complexity and color, the financial value of the mineral, the weight, the color, the formation, where does it come from? Is it volcanic or is it some other origin? The geographic origin, where was it found? Magnetism, smell. Does it have crystals? Does it have metals? Along those major dimensions that would be interesting to a psychic or to somebody looking at the rock. And the targets, the first target was a rare earth. Rare earth, as you know, are very valuable. It was in part European. It came from Death Valley. And one thing I discovered is that the geologists, which we think of as pretty rough types who go out with a hammer, you know, in the wilds of Alaska, can be extremely literary and poetic, not in general, but about one thing, about rocks, you know. A somewhat flat angular fragment that is pale red, moderate pink, and light brownish gray in color. It is composed of several non-metallic minerals. It comes from a unique mineral occurrence at Mountain Pass, California, a mine with the potential to corner the world's rare earth market. So I thought if Ingo or some of those guys can find where it comes from, and if they can find one or two others, you know, we're going to be funding psychic research for a long, long time, because this is the one mine in the world that has Europia. And furthermore, it's, you know, it's an interesting rock. I'm not going to read all the descriptions. This is going to be on the web, so you can read the descriptions. They are beautiful. And we did all the descriptions, and we logged them out before we started the experiment. So the geologists didn't see any of the things that the psychics did or that the participants did later. This was completely independent, and it stayed in an archive to be given to the judges at the end, after the experiment. This was mercury from Alaska. Specimen relatively large, somewhat tabular. They use all these words that are very precise, and I find somewhat poetic. Although overall it is irregular and angular in form. One side is composed of fine-grained, medium-dark gray rock. The rest is a fine-grained aggregate of a metallic, silvery gray mineral, that stibnite, and one that is bright red. It is quite heavy. So you see, they were following instructions of beauty, color, weight, and physical properties. This was magnetite. So again, I thought it's interesting if somebody described a magnetic field in the reading, okay? You can't do any of that with Zener cards, okay? That's pretty clear. Strongly magnetic, comes from British Columbia. This is cobalt from the Nabeska Quadrangle in Alaska. Most of it coated with a pinkish, light to moderate, red, earthy material. Most of the rest is light brown. Realgar, aggregated with Arpanet from Utah. Yeah, this one was interesting because it has a smell. It had a sulfur smell to it. So again, we thought this would be interesting to give to as a test. This is precious opal from Virginia Valley in Nevada. A small, irregularly angular fragment that is roughly pyramidal in shape. Most of the specimen is a pale brown, aphanitic siliceous rock with a conchoidal fracture. It is transected by thin, discontinuous veinlets that are translucent and have a play of delicate colors, deep green, blue, and milky white. This will become important later when we talk about the transcripts. A salt crystal from Nevada, beautiful specimen of crystalline halite, which is salt, and this almost pure form is practically transparent, looks very much like quartz. Halite is formed from sedimentary evaporative beds. Silver ore from central Nevada, Galena. Again, this was for the economic value, obviously. Gold from the Mother Lode, approximately rectangular with two semi-parallel larger surfaces and edges. Barite from Dagway Proving Grounds in Utah, conspicuously layered. Again, this was an interesting rock because it was formed in layers. And at the end of the sessions, we gave all the transcripts from the computer. I had my secretary retype them in a uniform, one page per transcript with the same typewriter, so they all looked the same. There was no hint of where they came from or the time or anything else. They all looked the same. We gave them to 5 independent judges. We gave them the rocks, and we gave them the geological description, and we asked them to match it with a technique that Russ and Hal taught me of using 3 different matches, best match, second best, third best, and then we did the statistics based on that. But the point was not really statistics. Here's 2 transcripts of 2 people looking at the halite, the salt. Richard Bach is sitting in Florida with his terminal. He writes, a small donut of quartz crystals, like a keyring had fallen into a supersaturated salt solution overnight. Ingo wrote from New York, I have the impression I could look right through it. Remember the geologist said it's almost transparent? Okay, you have an exact match, almost word by word. Damn, I wish it would keep still. Crystal, crystal, crystal ball, glass, crystal, clear crystal. Okay? Richard Bach talking about the opal. Why do I keep getting greens? Again, the geologist mentioned it was green, blue-green. I see a medium-sized green wedge. I don't see a pure emerald crystal, much as I would like to. Now, this is an experienced remote viewer. He knows what he would like to see, and that's not it. But he knows what he's seeing, and he's describing something as if he had the rock in his hand. It is flecked and connected to a coarse rock edging. It looks to me like it was poured, a heavy liquid green plastic, the green becoming blue-green at the edges of the sample, and if fractured, it would be in one clean, smooth break of glassine purity. Now, I mean, there is no, I mean, this is not statistics, okay? This is pure, unadulterated remote viewing. So we did an analysis, and again, I don't want to present it as more than a proof of concept. But the actual target was assigned the highest score, in other words, correctly identified in normal language, in 8 out of 33 cases. And by chance, looking at the whole matrix would happen once in 100 trials. Okay. As you know, there have been remote viewing tests that have gone much better statistically. But again, this was a proof of concept. The overall statistical test gave a P of 0.08 of achieving the distribution by chance. But 2 participants, Ingo and Richard, accounted for all the group's results. The rest of us were essentially at chance. And the rest of us included some people who had trained themselves in remote viewing or were picked because they had the gift in remote viewing. So the other surprise was that the double-blind test and the open experiment where the geologist was holding the actual rock gave the same results. Now, again, we cannot generalize from that, but that was, we thought surely there would be a difference between the two. That's why we had designed it that way. Well, there was no difference. And the features that were best identified were the color, the shape, the weight, the presence of crystals, as you saw, the type of material, metallic, for example, versus non-metallic, and sometimes a geological process. It was volcanic rather than metamorphic and so on. The common errors were the location and the electromagnetic property. This was somewhat of a shock, and again, this is not something we could pursue. We were not funded to do psychical research, But this was interesting because I would have thought the europium sample, again, could only come from one mine on the planet. And if you could find 2 or 3 others, again, this would be, very significant. And the magnetite sample was strongly magnetic, and that was missed. Nobody picked it up. Okay, so again, let's forget that. Let's not generalize from all that. The important thing is, what about the next 10 years? We've looked 50 years in the back. Well, clearly, I think we came away from this convinced that the new digital media offered psychical research one more tool. It's not going to replace anything, but it's another arrow in your quiver if you want to do research. It's economical. This whole experiment lasted 2 months. It cost $25,000. Well, we could find $25,000. It's not $1 million. But today you could do it essentially with no money. You could do it on Facebook. So on a modified version of Facebook that somebody could program for you. But it's an opportunity to experiment without time and space being factors. With good control of external conditions, you can guard against cheating, and cheating is always, there will always be somebody who says, well, maybe they had some contraption to communicate and so on, but you can guard against it much better with this kind of setting than you would otherwise even in the lab. This was an experiment in computer science using parapsychology. It was not an experiment in parapsychology using computers, okay? But the results were intriguing enough, and we think they introduced a new technology. And in fact, Deborah Katz is now using similar things, and a number of people are beginning to use computer networks to do parapsychology research. But they can, maybe looking back at what we did, there may be some interesting points that would inform what's going to be done in the future. The second conclusion is that the phenomena that hackers and programmers call anecdotes of synchronicity. Gee, isn't it strange that I woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning? I know a man who's become a friend of mine. He's written a remarkable book. Recently married a woman that he had met on a dating network, on a dating site. They both logged in at the same time at 3 o'clock in the morning. And they started a conversation, and 6 months later they were married. So, I mean, that's the kind of thing that, again, that's an anecdote. It may not be reproducible statistically, but it's interesting. So these phenomena that programmers treat as, amusing synchronicities can be a base of study, especially in synchronous group interaction, where the coincidences can be documented, because you can run an AI program that would analyze, the text itself, the document, and so on. So the lesson is you should fire the statisticians and hire some good hackers and go do it. Maybe not fire all the statisticians, Jessica, if you're in the room. Yeah, but we still need you. We need you later, okay? Not for the experiment. So, Rupert Sheldrake, you were telling me that Rupert Sheldrake is doing now telepathy tests using text messages. Again, the next 10 years, training is a major challenge. So my first exposure to Ingo and to Hal and Russell, I was a consultant, but I was an unpaid consultant, because remember, it had to do with UFOs and things like that, so I couldn't be on the payroll. Furthermore, I was already paid by SRI to do something else, so everything was fine. And of course, among the people who were very interested in UFOs, there was also Uri Geller at the time at SRI. And we became friends, and we were also, involved in some of that discussion. But then I came back later at the request of Ingo. When I was outside SRI, I came back as a consultant in the methodology development, and I was trained by Ingo. And I wasn't trained by Ingo to be a remote viewer. I was trained by Ingo to see how best to design the steps in the training to make people aware of what remote viewing, how remote viewing was structured. Okay, but it was, you know, it was an extraordinary experience, and I was at SRI twice a week, working with Ingo in that little room at the top, and it made me aware of a number of abilities that we all have. The problem is, how do we exercise that in a reliable way, not in a spontaneous, anecdotal way? And the best way I can describe it is, you can train me to get notes out of a piano. I mean, I even know how to do that. But this is not the Rag 2. This is not the second, you know, concerto by Rachmaninoff. If you want to do the Rag 2, you have to hit that piano for 10 years, 10 hours a day. Okay, and then you may not be able to do the Rachmaninoff second concerto. So I think it's, what I remembered from our experiment was that Ingo and Richard Bach accounted for all our results, even though we had very talented people around the network. The rest of us were at the noise level, essentially. So the skeptics are right to say, you know, we're not going to launch a missile based on what you guys are saying, because, you know, the error is there. So what you can hope to bring is an additional dimension to a very complex decision, whether it's in business, in investment, which obviously interests me, or in mining, or in exploration and production, or in other areas, not just in the military, or not just in intelligence. I have two more conclusions. Some fundamental avenues of research have never been explored, and they are just waiting to be explored by parapsychology. And why not? I mean, as an outsider, you know, I have to ask you the question, why didn't you look at that? Well, the answer is that experiments like Stargate were funded by the government. More specifically, the truth be told, by the intelligence community, as, you know, the recent books have explained. I mean, the book by Ed and the books by Russell. And the moment the thing started working, they needed to apply it to something. I mean, this was very quickly, and in my opinion, prematurely, turned into an application development. You know, they use a methodology to train their people who are intelligence officers or military people or consultants to use this and apply it to something else, which is fine. But in my opinion, there were lots of issues that had not been clarified, including some of the issues that we had highlighted in my experiments in 1975, okay, that nobody ever went back to redo this and redo it with a larger number of subjects. It should be done. We don't know what we would find, but it should be done. The other conclusion is that we should look at the information domain. I've given a TEDx talk in Brussels 4 years ago about information physics being the last little sister of physics. Physics that we teach and the physics that people talk about today with quantum mechanics and relativity and so on, that's all the physics of energy. Well, physicists tell us, they teach us, except that we forget completely when the class is over, they teach us that information and energy are the same thing. They are the two sides of the same thing. They are different, but they are linked together within the same universe. So there is the physics that we teach today has a little sister somewhere which we've lost. And that little sister is the physics of information. The physics of information doesn't have time, it doesn't have space, it doesn't have molecules, it doesn't have atoms, but it has all the rest of the real things in the world. including thoughts, including consciousness, including all the things that we're trying to come to grips with in parapsychology. So why are we slavishly going to ask permission of the physicists to use their theories of entanglement? The entanglement is great, by the way, because if the truth be told, time and space are emergent properties of entanglement. So they are coming to the same realization that maybe there isn't anything like time and space, that the main thing there is entanglement, and then other things happen, like these chairs and, you know, us and consciousness and other things. But that, so, but they're not teaching that yet. Okay, but this is what some, and you can get a PhD in physics without ever being exposed to that. But in 5 years, 10 years, that could be the mainstream. And then a lot of interesting things are going to happen. And then the physicists are going to come here saying, tell us again, how is it that you do remote viewing? You know, because we have a problem with entanglement. You know, and so I think quantum physics is a wonderful thing. Relativity is a wonderful thing. They're in complete conflict with each other, which nobody wants to talk about the conflict, but be that as it may, they are wonderful. But I think psychical research should lead and not follow physics. You know, I come from astrophysics, and if you take what happens in astrophysics and you show it to, you go to your local physics lab, there is no way they know what you're talking about. You're talking about billions, billions and billions and billions of degrees at the center of the sun. You're talking about fusion reactions at an amazing scale. You're talking about gravity doing things that we really don't understand, that cannot be duplicated in the physics lab. So the astronomers have never gone to the physicists, you know, asking them to duplicate what they were doing, or asking permission to continue to work with these extraordinary pressures and temperatures and energy fluxes and so on. They just do their work using the universe as their lab. Okay, I think you have to do the same thing. To give you an example, something as simple in quotes as the solar corona, the center of the sun is at billions of degrees. It's fusion. Okay, it's not really understood. The structure is not understood, but we know the temperature. We know the plasma temperature. And then the temperature goes down to the surface of the sun, which is at 10,000 degrees, because we can measure that. And 10,000 degrees in astronomy is like zero. So in all the models of the sun, you take the surface of the sun to be at zero temperature, which is close enough compared to the rest of the sun. The corona, which you can only see in a total eclipse, the corona is at billions of degrees. How does that happen? You know, how does, we don't really see where the energy is transferred. Now, there are theories about that and so on, but this is the kind of thing, and science is full of things like that are major things of major complexity that are not understood. It's not just consciousness that's not understood. The rest of it isn't understood either. So I think that's why I say again, and that's my conclusion, that you should lead here and not follow. Thank you.